You have exactly 3 seconds to like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I'll appear in your dreams tonight. To ask for a donation for that cup of coffee, link below.
KTQS extends its greetings to all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, the end of fascist Japan was perhaps sealed the moment the Pacific War broke out at 7:55 on 1941. When, without declaring war, unexpectedly attacked Pearl Harbor on the island of Hawaii, directly sinking and damaging 19 warships and killing 300 American soldiers. This burglary caused unprecedented damage to the United States, even leading U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt to call December 7th a day of disgrace. The actions of the Japanese government have provoked deep indignation among the American people. The Congress quickly agreed to abandon its isolationist stance of not interfering in the affairs of other countries, shifting to a firm policy of opposing fascist Japan. On December 8, U.S. President Roosevelt appeared before Congress and declared war on Japan. 3 days later, he declared war on Germany and Italy. The United States became a country fighting on both the European and Asian fronts simultaneously. Japan foolishly awakened the American giant, as lamented. General, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, and the mastermind behind the attack on Pearl Harbor. This general, having studied in the United States, was very familiar with the economic, military, and scientific and technological potential of that country, and he believed that Japan could never defeat the United States. This statement led the Japanese militarists to label him a traitor and demand his execution. Due to its vague views on Japanese militarism, the US was unprepared for a long time to fight Japan. In the Pacific, the US only had 3 aircraft carriers, Na, Ka, and 54. Meanwhile, the Japanese had 10, and 113 ships respectively. So the American forces initially had to make a tactical retreat. The Japanese army, emboldened by its victory, advanced southward, occupying most of Southeast Asia and many important American strongholds, as well as British, French, and Dutch colonies in the Pacific, and reaching close to Australia. However, the US also promptly retaliated against Japan with some painful blows, such as on April 8, 1920, when Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's B-25 squadron took off from an aircraft carrier and bombed Tokyo, shaking the entire country of the land of the rising sun. The Navy sank its first Japanese aircraft carrier in the Battle of Midway in early July of that year, ending Japan's unbeaten streak. The US government quickly mobilized the entire population to participate in the war, shifting its massive industrial base to the task of manufacturing and improving weapons, and strengthening its military forces. Military spending increased from $5 billion in 1940 in 1942 and $38 billion in 1943, far exceeding Japan's. As a result, the American forces gradually grew stronger and, from the end of began to gain the initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, after losing the Marianas Islands, the morale of the Japanese army plummeted, and many Japanese people began to contemplate defeat. Since American planes began bombing regularly, all economic activities, industrial production, and weapons manufacturing in mainland Japan suffered increasingly severe damage. Faced with a shortage of aircraft and warships, the Japanese High Command decided to employ suicide bombing tactics using aircraft, mini, and man torpedoes. This new tactic caused significant difficulties and losses for the US, but it was also very disadvantageous for Japan, as it lost almost all of its pilots. While Japan was already short of pilots, and training a pilot took longer than building an aircraft. In total, more than 200 kamikaze pilots were killed in action, a huge and irreplaceable loss. After that, Japanese planes were no longer able to take off, giving American planes even more freedom to control the skies, bombarding and dropping bombs on any target where Japanese troops were present. On May 7, 1940, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The guns fell silent in Europe, Germany's defeat foreshadowed that militaristic Japan would soon suffer a similarly humiliating fate. But the Japanese fascists continued their furious resistance against the Allies. The Asia-Pacific front continues to resound with bombs and bullets. In June, the Japanese cabinet met, and the hawkish faction, which held a majority, resolved to fight to the death on our home soil. To fight to the last Japanese. Emperor Hirohito remained silent on that decision. Therefore, the people of Japan and the world continue to shed blood in vain. Ladies and gentlemen, on 19, the Potsdam Declaration was officially announced to the world. Millions of leaflets containing this declaration in Japanese were dropped by American planes throughout Japan, and no Japanese citizen was unaware of its contents. Article 13 of the Potsdam Declaration states, the Japanese government must declare the immediate and unconditional surrender of all Japanese troops, and any other choice will only lead to the swift and complete destruction of Japan. The order for Japan to surrender unconditionally had been given. Refusal to surrender meant Japan choosing a faster, more tragic path to self-destruction. But under pressure from the emperor and the military, the then Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki Kentaro did not respond to the demands of the Potsdam Declaration. According to Professor Komori of the University of Tokyo, the main reason Japan delayed accepting the Potsdam Declaration was that Emperor Hirohito was only concerned with preserving the imperial system and protecting the three sacred objects of the imperial family. Those three sacred objects are a Baji mirror, worshipped at Ai's shrine, a grass-cutting sword, and a Baji jewel, worshipped at two other shrines. These are three mythical treasures, traditionally believed to be the ancestors of the Japanese people. The emperor was worried that these sacred objects would be destroyed, especially since on July 24th, American bombs had narrowly missed the Ai shrine. Ladies and gentlemen, in that critical moment, when thousands of Japanese people were dying every day from the carpet bombing by the Allied forces, the Japanese emperor showed no concern for the lives of the people and millions of Japanese soldiers, selfishly only caring about preserving his throne and the sacred legacy of his ancestors, thus hesitating and missing the opportunity to respond to the demands of the Potsdam Declaration. That action led the Allies to conclude that Japan was determined to fight to the last man, and the American president could not help but consider a response. So, what terrible consequences would President Truman's final decision have? A week had passed without any response from Japan regarding the Potsdam Declaration, and President Truman was extremely worried. He wanted Japan to surrender but hesitated to land troops on Japanese soil, even though thousands of warships and millions of American soldiers were ready with a fiery spirit of victory. Truman knew that attacking from the sea would inevitably result in enormous casualties, and that it was uncertain when he could defeat the 5 million skilled Japanese troops entrenched in underground fortifications, on the 4 main islands and on their warships, not to mention the same number of Japanese troops stationed in other Asian countries and Pacific islands. Furthermore, tens of millions of Japanese citizens are ready to sacrifice themselves for the emperor. They will fight to the last man in guerrilla warfare after the United States conquers mainland Japan. This problem is truly incredibly difficult. Truman recalled the harsh realities of the Iwo Jima landing. The American forces outnumbered the Japanese by 3 times. Yet it still took them nearly 40 days to capture the island. 1,000 Japanese soldiers, almost all were killed, with only a few hundred surviving. The US suffered 30 casualties. The recent landing on Okinawa, despite the overwhelming advantage of over 150,000 soldiers, 300, still took the US 2 months to capture the island. Japanese suicide planes crashed into American warships, and Japanese soldiers fought to the death without surrendering, resulting in 1,000 American casualties. 1,000 American troops attacked site. As many 1,000 Japanese soldiers on the island fought to the last man. A wounded Japanese soldier detonated a grenade to commit suicide rather than be captured as a prisoner of war by the Americans. The Japanese people on the island jumped from high cliffs into the deep sea, with parents carrying their children and wading into the water until they drowned. The American soldiers were terrified by what they saw, covering their faces and weeping, losing all will to fight. 2 Japanese officers commanding the island's defense, General Yoshitsugu Sato and Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, shot themselves in the head, refusing to surrender. That situation was quite different from the Battle of Stalingrad, where German Field Marshal Paulus, seeing that defeat was inevitable, led 90,000 German soldiers to surrender to the Soviet Red Army with a white flag. It's clear that German soldiers weren't as recklessly suicidal as the Japanese, driven by the spirit of samurai. Ladies and gentlemen, an army that is not afraid of death is truly terrifying. President Truman recalled a plan called Operation Coronet to attack mainland Japan, drafted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This scenario estimates that American casualties in Operation Coronet would be 1. He knew that the American people would never allow a president to sacrifice so many of their children. Ultimately, Truman chose to use the atomic bomb so that the US wouldn't need to land an army on Japanese soil, yet still forced Japan to surrender. When the atomic bomb caused massive casualties and threatened the very survival of the Japanese nation, the Japanese emperor had no choice but to surrender to save his army and people, as well as his own life and that of the imperial family. But this decision could very well condemn Truman's name to eternal curse. He may have to bear the responsibility before history as the first person to use the atomic bomb. At 8:15 the B-29 Enola Gay Superfortress bomber, from an altitude of 10, dropped a uranium-235 bomb on Hiroshima, where the Southern Command headquarters and many Japanese military factories were located. The atmosphere was heated to 7,000 degrees. The entire city had truly become a sea of fire. 3 days later, at 6 on the 9th, news broke that the Soviet Union had declared war against Japan. That news meant that the Japanese Kwantung Army stationed in northeastern China had been attacked by the Soviet Red Army. At 11 that same day, the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Approximately 1,000 people in total. More than 1,000 Japanese people lost their lives simply because the Japanese government hesitated to accept the Potsdam Declaration. They hesitated and delayed making a decision on a matter of paramount importance to the survival of the Japanese nation. Ladies and gentlemen, it's all because they want to preserve the imperial regime, which they consider sacred and inviolable. The Japanese began anxiously waiting to see where the third bomb would fall. The situation was extremely critical, forcing Japan to immediately respond as to whether or not it accepted the Potsdam Declaration. Immediately afterwards, the king attended the Royal Conference of the Supreme War Steering Council. During the meeting, the number of people supporting the trade and the war factions was now equal. So Prime Minister Suzuki requested the emperor to make a decision. Upon careful consideration, the Japanese side was fundamentally unprepared for a decisive battle on their home turf. If they blindly pursued a decisive battle, it would inevitably lead to the downfall and genocide of the nation. The emperor still wants to pass on to future generations what is called the Japanese nation. Japan 6 commemorates its first defeat today. That day was also the first time the Japanese emperor cried. Japan officially surrendered. According to the schedule, on 19th, Tokyo Radio would broadcast the emperor's edict to all his subjects, recorded on a disc. But throughout the previous night, 30 young officers in the Kamikaze Suicide Squad, commanded by a captain, traveled by truck from Yokohama port to Tokyo, radiating murderous intent, declaring they would kill all the national traitors, the pacifist faction, and force the emperor to accept their demand to fight to the bitter end. They went on a frenzied machine gun rampage, killing the commander of the Imperial Guard Division, General, and beheading his younger brother after being advised not to oppose the emperor. The coup plotters themselves wrote Order No. 584 of the Guard, stamped it with the division commander's seal, and distributed it to various places. Then they stormed the Imperial Palace, searching for the audio recording of the Imperial Decree. But because the palace was so vast, they couldn't find it. At 5 General Tanaka ordered the arrest of the major who signed Order 584, and called the colonel commanding the 2nd Regiment, ordering him to withdraw all troops from the Imperial Palace. Ladies and gentlemen, the coup ended in a disastrous failure as the entire Japanese population gathered around loudspeakers and radios to hear the emperor's voice for the first time in their lives. At exactly 12 noon on August 15th, the radio station played the Japanese national anthem. Then, Emperor Hirohito's voice rang out. After considering the major trends of the world and the current state of the empire, EI. Japan, I wish to take extraordinary measures to resolve the situation. I hereby inform my loyal and virtuous subjects. I have ordered the imperial government to inform the 4 nations of America, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union to accept their joint communiqué. In other words, it meant accepting unconditional surrender, but to save face. The Imperial Edict did not use words like defeat or surrender. The Imperial Edict also stated previously, I did not intend to invade other countries. Japan's declaration of war against the United States and Great Britain was due to the need for self-preservation and security of East Asia. But the war situation did not improve, and the major trends in the world were unfavorable to us. Furthermore, the enemy recently used a type of bomb that ruthlessly killed innocent people, causing immeasurable damage. If the fighting continues, it will ultimately lead to the destruction of our nation and the ruin of human civilization. This means that Japan ceased hostilities not because of defeat, but simply to avoid the catastrophe of its civilians being killed by atomic bombs. The Imperial Decree also ignored Japan's invasion of China and its devastating defeat by the Soviet Union in Manchuria. In short, the Japanese government remained extremely stubborn. Faced with this situation, Douglas MacArthur, commander of the Allied forces, handed Japan 3 documents to sign. The Emperor's proclamation on the cessation of hostilities, the surrender document, the military order No. 1 on the unconditional surrender of weapons. Upon receiving the aforementioned Imperial Decree of August 15th from the Emperor, Japanese troops on all fronts, both domestic and foreign, immediately ceased hostilities, and subsequently surrendered their weapons when the Allied forces arrived to disarm them. Japan established a new government with Prince Higashikuni as Prime Minister and appointed the Minister of Foreign Affairs, along with the Chief of Staff of the Army, to lead the Japanese delegation to sign the unconditional surrender document on September 2nd, aboard the battleship Missouri anchored in the South China Sea. Ladies and gentlemen, this marked the end of the Pacific War, creating extremely favorable conditions for many Asian nations, including Viet Nam, to regain independence from Western empires. A new era dawned in the East, an era of disintegration and collapse of colonialism worldwide. That concludes the video about the decline of fascist Japan. What are your thoughts? Please leave them in the comments below. And now, goodbye and see you in the next videos.